Hello and welcome to another RWR solo show. I'm Ben Spindler and thanks for joining me for this one, which of course is about the Elimination Chamber show which took place on Sunday. And we're going to go straight to the headlines for this particular review rather than go through match by match and break down the matches in terms of their quality, which we will get to. We're going to go straight to the headlines first of all. And the biggest headline, I guess, coming out of the show was The Miz's cash-in of his Money in the Bank contract on Drew McIntyre at the conclusion of the show. Now, obviously, since then, there's been a lot of negativity, a lot of people saying they're not particularly happy that The Miz has cashed in his Money in the Bank and won the WWE Championship. And I can kind of understand that, but I don't personally have a huge problem with that in isolation. I think on its own, that is fine. It doesn't really bother me too much. It's not the best, but it's fine. It is what it is. We've got the Money in the Bank stipulation. It's here to stay, and that is going to mean that some people who don't deserve to be champion or theoretically aren't on that level as a top tier star are sometimes going to win the WWE Championship. It's a consequence of the Money in the Bank gimmick as a whole, and that's a conversation for a different time. But I think the bigger problem with this was that you can't take it in isolation. If you look at it as part of this show as a whole, it becomes a bigger problem. And I say that because on this show, called Elimination Chamber, we had two chamber matches, both of which lasted around 40 minutes in length. So really quite important, big matches involving big stars from the whole of the WWE roster. You know, some of the biggest names on the roster right now. And by the end of the show, neither of those matches actually meant anything. Neither of them had any consequence whatsoever, because within minutes of the first match, obviously Daniel Bryan won that match and Roman Reigns came out and beat him in the title match that Bryan had earned by winning that chamber match. And then later in the show, Drew McIntyre had come through 5 contenders for his title in the second chamber match, and then within minutes of that had lost that very belt. And so effectively both Elimination Chamber matches were rendered completely insignificant straight away, which was a great shame. And I think also a disservice to the people that took part in these matches, because they've just gone through a 40-minute match. In the case of Daniel Bryan, he's been in the match for 40 minutes. He was the number 1 or 2 entrant into the chamber and then lasted the whole way and won the match. So he's put himself through a lot. It's a big performance from him, and it's a great match. Go back and watch that match. It's a fantastic chamber match. There's no point at which anything's wasted. Everything makes sense. There's good sequences throughout. Everybody kind of has a bit of time with everybody else that they're in the ring with. Even Baron Corbin, who I'm not a big fan of, King Corbin as he's now called, I thought they used him well as well. I thought the whole match was constructed really well. Nobody looked lesser for having been a part of it. I think everyone was elevated, and it was also a great match. And yet, within minutes, it meant nothing. It's got no significance. It's got no importance, because Roman Reigns has come out and beaten Daniel Bryan immediately after the match. And I don't really see why they needed to do that. You know, the Daniel Bryan Roman Reigns match lasted all of a few minutes. They could have saved that for SmackDown or for Fastlane that's coming in about a month's time. That could have been one of the main events of that show, and they could have given us a good 15 to 25 minute match. Those two could have put on something pretty special, and it could have given Roman Reigns another credibility enhancing victory on the road to WrestleMania. And I'm not suggesting that in any way Daniel Bryan should have beaten Roman Reigns for the title. I don't believe he should. I feel like Roman Reigns going into WrestleMania, where he's going to face Edge now, which was clear from the end of this segment, and WWE should do everything they can to deliver Reigns to WrestleMania as a worthy and competent and deserving champion, so that when he faces Edge, it really means something. But that's not to say that they should have just ditched off the Bryan-Roman Reigns championship match in this 2-minute segment straight after a match that has just happened, which was excellent and could have meant something. If you were coming out of Elimination Chamber on Sunday with the potential for a Daniel Bryan-Roman Reigns title match in the future, that could have been quite exciting. Unfortunately, you weren't given that opportunity, and instead all you were left with was this Reigns victory, which in different hands might have been fine. But Roman Reigns isn't a champion you need to do this with. In my view, Roman Reigns is being booked as a kind of killer heel, the kind of guy who's very good, going to be very tough to stop, but just has a really bad attitude. So there's no need for him to play the cowardly heel. There's no need for him to take these kind of opportunistic title victories. Roman Reigns should have been like, okay, bring it on, I'll face Daniel Bryan, even if they continued to sell the knee injury that Daniel Bryan picked up in the Chamber match, and use that as one of the central narratives of a match between the two for the title in the future. Now, obviously, they haven't done that, and they've already frittered away that title, and I'm obviously recording this on the Tuesday morning, so I've seen Elimination Chamber and I've heard about what's happened on Raw, so I'm up to date there. For all I know, they're going to resurrect a potential match between Daniel Bryan and Roman Reigns on SmackDown, and that will make some sense, although if they do that, I will once again be questioning why they had to have this moment take place at Elimination Chamber. For me, it's far better to leave your audience kind of anticipating a title match between the two as a consequence of Daniel Bryan's victory in the Chamber than to almost kind of disappoint that and throw that away within a few moments. Now, I realise I've gone off on a tangent a little bit there because we were originally talking about The Miz, but the reason I've done that is because it does feed into why I have a problem with the end of the show. Because having done that with Daniel Bryan and Roman Reigns earlier on in the show, it felt like the second Chamber match needed to be of some consequence. But no, again, Drew McIntyre's won an Elimination Chamber match, another very, very good match with some really good performances, people putting a hell of a lot of effort into them. And then moments after that match, again, we're kind of left with this sense of it didn't matter. There was no point in it happening. If Drew McIntyre hadn't defended the title in the Elimination Chamber, they could still have done exactly what they did later on and had Lashley attack Drew McIntyre and The Miz cash in the Money in the Bank. And I know, like, as I say, a lot of people have got a problem with The Miz winning the WWE Championship, especially so close to WrestleMania. I think my issue with it, again, is not that it's The Miz, or not even really that it's the Money in the Bank. It's just that apparently what seems to be the plan here for WWE is to go from where we were to a feud between Drew McIntyre and Bobby Lashley at WrestleMania. Now, that's not a particularly exciting potential matchup at that show for me personally, but that's fine. If that's what they want to do, if that's the plan that they've got for WrestleMania, okay, no problem. The problem I have with it is that match for me seems more special if Drew McIntyre, who has held the WWE Championship since effectively last WrestleMania, with the exception of 1 month since that point, goes in as champion and defends that lengthy reign as champion, rather than have Drew McIntyre go in as the challenger, which seems to be the direction they're heading in, especially as we know that Miz and Lashley are due to face each other on Raw next week. Now, I know there will be some people who will say that the chase is better sometimes than being the champion, so you sometimes want the babyface to be on that chase for the championship. The problem is here is that the chase is better when it's a lengthy chase that takes a long time. I'm thinking, like, go back to 1998, for example. Steve Austin loses the World Championship at Judgment Day in your house that year in October. He then has a 5-month kind of journey back to the title at WrestleMania the following year. That is a great chase. That's a great way to take your babyface into a main match. But here, we've got less than 7 weeks. We really haven't got that long until Drew McIntyre will go into WrestleMania, presumably to challenge Lashley for the title, if that is indeed the direction they go in. And so it doesn't really apply. That is not an effective way to book it. What's a far more effective way to book it is to say, Drew McIntyre's the champion. He's gone through everybody. He's beaten all these big names. He hasn't yet beaten Lashley. And Lashley looks like a monster, looks like a guy that seems unstoppable right now. And so that's how you push it. And there's no need to involve Miz and have this convoluted Money in the Bank cash-in that takes place at the end of Elimination Chamber. Now, there will be probably some people saying, what's the difference? What's the difference between the two scenarios you've laid out there, in terms of WWE's apparent plan and what I'm suggesting they should have done if that's the way they wanted to go? The difference for me is that you want to protect and continue to make feel special the championship. And for me, having a long reigning champion going into WrestleMania and then be faced with a new challenge of which it looks like it's going to be really hard to overcome is a far more valuable and exciting prospect than having a relatively recently crowned champion, as Lashley will be if he wins the title on Monday's Raw, against a new challenger. Like, it will effectively be Lashley's first big challenge. I mean, he may defend the title, I guess, at Fastlane as well. But the point is it won't be this kind of, it won't have the same gravitas to it because it's a new champion. It doesn't have the same pull, have the same level of excitement factor to me. And I just think this is a unnecessary bump on the road to WrestleMania. As I say, there's no need to do this. They could still go straight to the Lashley Drew McIntyre program, no problem at all. I also think that this impacts the booking of the triple threat match that they have earlier in the show. So there's a US title match. Bobby Lashley defends against John Morrison and against Matt Riddle in that contest. And Matt Riddle comes out as champion. Now, during the match, they did their best to protect Lashley. They made him look like a monster. They made him look completely dominant over these two other guys. And whilst the match was going on, I was thinking, I'm not really sure why they are completely jobbing out Morrison and Matt Riddle. Okay, Riddle went on to win the match, but he didn't look particularly good in doing so. And certainly he looked definitely inferior to the man who did win the match, Bobby Lashley. Now, obviously, when you learn that the plans for WrestleMania are that Bobby Lashley's going to go in for a World Championship match against Drew McIntyre, well, then it makes a bit more sense. You are trying to keep him strong ahead of that. But my issue again is, why not just keep the belt on Lashley? Like, it isn't like the US title. It's a massively important deal in WWE. It's not like a major championship that will draw people in to watch the show. So if you're worried about having another match on that show that's for the US title, well, it's a needless worry. Who cares if there's another match at WrestleMania for the US Championship? There's no rule against a US champion either going up against a WWE champion. And in fact, I think this could have been a core way of building the match between Lashley and Drew McIntyre. As you say, okay, Lashley comes out and says, like, I've been the US champion for nearly 6 months. I've beaten everybody who's come in my way. I've had no problems at all. I've beaten them all. Now I want the man who's been the world champion, the WWE champion for the last, basically for the last year. I want Drew McIntyre. I want to face him. And you have the match at WrestleMania be for both belts, a WWE and a US title. And you could even, if you want to then spin that into a rematch on the next show after WrestleMania, you can have, let me just plot out a potential route you could go. So you could have Drew McIntyre overcome Lashley at WrestleMania, hold both titles. Lashley then come out the next night on Raw or at some point in the next few weeks and say, I want my automatic title rematch that I am entitled to from my US title. So then you have another match between Lashley and Drew McIntyre, of which maybe Lashley wins back his title and then in the process says, well, I've just pinned the WWE champion. I want another match for that title. And then you can have another rematch between Drew McIntyre and Lashley for the title in some kind of gimmick match at a pay-per-view. Now, I'm almost certain they'll have a rematch anyway after WrestleMania. So there's a perfectly simple way of getting them to a couple of rematches and have a lengthier storyline that lasts beyond WrestleMania, because let's be honest, they'll probably go in that direction anyway. So for me, it just, again, was unnecessary. It's just an unnecessary title switch. For me, you shouldn't have had any title switches in those two. Either of those two titles should not have changed hands, in my view. You should have just kept them on the same people, and you could have had a perfectly reasonable reason for Drew McIntyre and Bobby Lashley to go into WrestleMania to face one another, with Drew McIntyre as the champion, defending his belt and keeping hold of that title. And the longer you keep him as champion, the more impactful it will be when he loses it to somebody you want to potentially put over. So, now it's not going to be, if Drew McIntyre loses, say he wins the title back against Lashley at WrestleMania, if that's where we're going, and I have to keep making that caveat because you don't know for certain that's where they're going, although it does seem that will be the case. If Drew McIntyre wins that match and then goes on a couple of months later and loses the title to somebody else, it won't have any kind of impact, because we've seen Drew McIntyre lose the belt to Randy Orton and win it back, and then we'll have seen Drew McIntyre lose the title to Miz, who's then lost it to Lashley, and then for McIntyre to win it back. And so we can almost be guaranteed that if he loses it again, there's a real chance he'll win it back. And it just means that the losing the title doesn't really have any consequence for McIntyre either. It doesn't feel like it won't feel like it will matter, because that title, he's already lost it a couple of times and easily won it back. So I think it just, again, lessens the impact that a match between the two at WrestleMania will have, and it will impact future stories and future attempts to put somebody else over on the back of Drew McIntyre's lengthy WWE title reign if you do it this way. So for me, like, the show itself in isolation, if you took this show on its own and said, what do you think of this show? As we do with our regular podcast, the Random Wrestling Review, where we basically are looking at the show in isolation, then Yeah, actually, it's not a bad show at all. In fact, it's a very, very good show. The two chamber matches are excellent. In particular, the opener, I thought was a phenomenal match. I thought it was excellently put together, really well paced. Someone had laid that out step by step and made sure it all made sense and made sure that everybody got something in, everybody was involved in some way, everyone had something to contribute. I thought that the second chamber match was also really good and had some really cool innovations. I especially liked the moment where Amas basically took away the panel of the chamber using his brute strength, which was, again, another little nice touch which put Amas over, and allowed AJ Styles to get into the match way earlier than he should have done. I thought that the way that they kind of had Kofi Kingston eliminate Randy Orton was another great little callback to their feud, and the fact that it wasn't at all expected. Overall, I thought both those matches were excellent. I also thought that the triple threat match was something with a little bit more creativity, a little bit of imagination. And yes, as I said earlier on, I was a little bit surprised by how much they kind of treated Riddle and Morrison a little bit like jobbers during the match. But given what they're trying to plan and trying to set up with Drew McIntyre, it does make sense now. And I thought it was a bit different. It had a little bit of a different style about it. It differentiated itself from the rest of the show. I thought the women's tag team match was okay. I didn't think it was bad at all. I still think that there's some issues there, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I just think that the whole show, in terms of the longer-term view, the longer-term plan, in terms of what they're going to do at WrestleMania, and in terms of the long-term view of the championships and their value within the company for selling matches that people are excited about, was flawed, and will be the reason why I kind of take this down a notch in terms of how much I enjoyed it. Although, as I say, as a card on its own, I can't really fault it. It was very, very good. So I've kind of touched upon and I've kind of spoken about the two chamber matches, and I've spoken about the triple threat match. There are three other matches that I've not really spoken about in any detail, and two of them last literally minutes. One of them, of course, is Roman Reigns coming down to defend the title against Daniel Bryan immediately after the first chamber match. There's not really a lot to say. I've already said what I felt about the booking of that, and I feel like it was a wasted opportunity, and again, a waste of the chamber match that had come before it. But, it was fine. It was what it was. And again, the Miz's victory over Drew McIntyre was only a minute long. It wasn't really a proper match. There's nothing to be critical of in terms of technically. There's nothing to be said other than what I've already said about the booking of this. One other thing about the booking, though, is the Money in the Bank concept. Is it starting to get to a point where we've run out of ways to make this feel good and feel interesting and exciting? I'm wondering whether or not it's about time we removed the nature of the Money in the Bank a little bit and tweak the rules maybe. So some people have suggested having the winner of the Money in the Bank be the contender for the championship at SummerSlam, which I don't think is a terrible idea. It makes sense. If you want to maintain a sense of the Money in the Bank holder can cash in at any point, maybe you could say something that they can cash in at any point, except they have to give a week's notice or 24 hours notice or something, which just means that people can anticipate it a little bit. Because there's also a sort of suggestion here where, if people knew that The Miz was going to cash in at the end of the Elimination Chamber, I'm not sure that wouldn't have enhanced the interest in this show. If you knew that Drew McIntyre was going to have a match in the Elimination Chamber, he was going to have to defend the title, and if he came out of that match, or whoever came out of that match, would then have to defend against The Miz because he had put everybody on notice, say 48 hours before the show on SmackDown or something, that he was going to come out and take on whoever won, then that, for me, might have increased the excitement for the show ahead of time. I just don't really think the surprise factor works anymore, and I also think that it does tend to lead to these kinds of scenarios where WWE feel boxed in by their booking from the past. Like when they do the Money in the Bank in sort of June or July or whenever it usually takes place, they don't necessarily know what they want to do with that Money in the Bank holder. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they know they want them to cash in at SummerSlam, or they want them to cash in maybe the next night, or even the night of the Money in the Bank. But very often they don't really know what they want to do. They just know they have to have a winner of the Money in the Bank, and then they're picking that winner at a time when they don't know if it's going to be convenient in the future for that person to hold the Money in the Bank. And I think that's very much what's happened this year, when they gave the victory to Otis because he was on a bit of an upward trajectory. They felt like he had some momentum and they wanted to get behind him, and then for whatever reason they've changed their mind since that point, and they had to switch the Money in the Bank to The Miz because they realized that Otis was never going to be somebody that they felt like could legitimately cash in this Money in the Bank and become the champion. But they still then were left with The Miz holding the Money in the Bank briefcase, a wrestler who has been mid-card at best for some time now. To the extent where Miz was the guy who was chosen to sell for Bad Bunny, a non-wrestler, at the Royal Rumble. Like, they obviously don't see him as some kind of guy that they need to protect, but they've got him in the position of holding the Money in the Bank, and that kind of creates a problem because not only does it kind of cast this shadow over every major title defense, because there's this question in people's mind is The Miz going to come out and cash in that Money in the Bank now? But also it means you've got to try and fit it in somewhere between, now and the next Money in the Bank show. So it kind of books them into a corner that they don't want to be in. And so I just wonder whether or not we can change these rules a little bit so that, yes, the champion still can cash in whenever they want, except they have to give notice a certain amount of time ahead of the cash in, so that their odds of winning the championship are less. And it means that they don't have to then, it doesn't have to become this major thing. It doesn't have to become something where if they lose, they look terrible. That actually maybe more often they do right now, they do lose. They don't necessarily get the victory for the championship, but it means that you don't have to make the decision about who you are effectively saying will be champion in the future when you are booking this match at Money in the Bank, which might not be at a point when you know who you want to be a challenger for that belt in the future. So I think that's another thing they want to look at, in my opinion, is how they use the Money in the Bank, what the rules are for that. And there's nothing to say that a general manager or somebody up on high can't say something to the effect of, look, we reviewed the Money in the Bank, we've seen what it's done over the last 15 years or whatever, we've decided now actually what's going to happen instead is that if you want to cash in your Money in the Bank, you can still do that at any point during the rest of the year after Money in the Bank, but you have to give us 24 hours notice before you're going to do it, or a week's notice before you do it. There was one other match on the show which I haven't really spoken about very much in detail, which was the women's tag team match. I thought it was fine, and I can understand a little bit why they're going in the direction they're going with Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair. It does appear now that those two will face each other at WrestleMania for the SmackDown Women's Championship, and I think doing it this way where they are kind of tag team, they're a tag team and they kind of get in the way of each other, or it doesn't really work out and they start to get a little bit frustrated with each other as they get closer and closer to WrestleMania. That makes perfect sense. It's been done before, but it's not a problem. It's a nice tidy little way to get them to WrestleMania. The problem in this match though was, and I've tried to reserve judgment on Nia Jax for quite some time because she's been getting a lot of stick, she's been getting a lot of criticism, and I wanted to kind of wait it out and just give her the opportunity to change my mind about her work. But clearly, I think here showed that she is one of the weaker wrestlers on the women's roster at the moment. She had a very awkward moment quite early on in the match with Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair, and when you aren't able to kind of create anything of real quality with those two, you're in trouble. And I think that when it was clear to me that the match quality improved every time Shayna Baszler was in the ring instead of Nia Jax. And I think at some point somebody's going to have to figure out what they do about that and how they resolve that issue. But yeah, it was okay. It wasn't a bad match. I can't really see what they're doing with the Reginald thing. It does appear as if they want Carmella to stay involved in the title picture with these two. And again, they've still got Fastlane to promote before WrestleMania, so maybe that's part of it. Maybe they're going to have another Sasha Banks Carmella Women's Championship match, which will in some way build further the feud or the match between Banks and Belair at WrestleMania. But yeah, it was fine. It wasn't anything special. It was okay. I've no real comment about that. I guess the only other thing that is worth mentioning is the fact that they dropped the planned Asuka versus Lacey Evans match that was due to take place for the Raw Women's Championship because Lacey Evans' announcement on Monday night that she's pregnant is actually legitimate and therefore she couldn't wrestle. It's strange, however, that WWE would suggest that it's Ric Flair's baby, and certainly if maybe they're sort of rooting around for some way to shoehorn that into some kind of match at WrestleMania, which will involve Charlotte Flair and her father Rick, and maybe have somebody else step into the ring on behalf of Lacey Evans. And so maybe they just didn't want to reveal maybe they didn't want to just drop that storyline just yet before they've been able to figure out what they want to do. But ultimately, it led to the cancellation of Asuka's title match there as well. So yeah, I mean, there's not a huge amount to talk about other than what I've talked about, because it was a kind of a strange show. There's been some criticism of it as well for its length, only 2.5 hours, which is probably about, somebody mentioned it might be the shortest pay-per-view of the last 20 years. Now, I don't know if that's true. I've no way to validate that or not, but it certainly was on the short side. That can be in part attributed to the fact that they only really had 4 matches lined up for this, if you don't count the 2 kind of impromptu matches, which is the 2 title matches, obviously Reigns versus Bryan and The Miz versus Drew McIntyre. But yeah, it was kind of on the short side, and that meant that there isn't so much to talk about. I think the main talking points for me are about the booking, as I've already discussed. And as I say, just a real shame, because those 2 chamber matches were so good that I feel like they deserved a longer legacy than just a few minutes. Like, it felt like they really did a disservice to the men involved in the matches, and that's a real shame. Anyway, that's everything that I want to say about the show. So thank you for getting this far if you've managed to do so. Check out everything else we do on the Random Wrestling Review. Obviously, our podcast, available on all good podcasting apps. Pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts, you can hear it. Every single week, we review another show. Every single Sunday, we bring them out. They're about shows in the past, and they're from all over the place. Just recently, we've done our WWE Elimination Chamber 2013 review, but there's also a number of other episodes to check out there, and we'll be bringing them out every single week as well. You can also please subscribe to this channel. This is obviously our YouTube hub. We're trying to grow this as well, so it'd be great if you could kind of subscribe and like this video and really get involved from that perspective. We're also available on lots of places on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can find us on all those channels at RWR Pod UK. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, and I will catch you again the next time.